This podcast is brought to you by D&D Beyond. D&D Beyond is the official digital tool set of Dungeons and Dragons. You can get all kinds of awesome stuff there. If you're a game designer, I really recommend you check out and use D&D Beyond. It makes it so much easier when I'm writing adventures, designing subclasses, working on other character options, monsters, that kind of thing. Plus, they got lots of great content. I'm talking about stuff from James Hake. I'm talking about stuff from Todd Kenrick, and so much more. That stuff is free. It's free. It helps the community so much. You can check out D&D Beyond for free. They have the basic rules up there, which is a lot of what you need. So go check it out over at dndbeyond.com. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, I'm talking with David Hartledge. David is the author of the DM David blog. He is a long-time D&D player and just an amazing human being. I am very proud to call him one of my friends. He's super smart and he knows a ton about the history of D&D, and that is what we're going to talk about today. It is fascinating. This is just a skim of the surface. I would love to have him back on to do a deep dive into each edition of the game. So without further ado, here is my interview with him. All right, everybody, now I am here with one of my favorite people and somebody who I'm really excited. I've wanted to have on the podcast for a long time. Finally got it together. It was mostly on my end that this had not happened, and I'm glad it finally is. David, welcome to Tabletop Babble. For people who don't know, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
I'm delighted to be here. I write a blog called DM David at dmdavid.com. And a few years ago, I just decided that I had an urge to spout off about Dungeons and Dragons. And the new edition was coming. And I just started writing posts, drawing from a history with D&D that dates back to the Blue Box Basic set. So it turns out that when I started, I thought that I'd probably go for a couple of months and then run out of steam, run out of things to say about Dungeons and Dragons. But it turns out that you can just start writing about Dungeons and Dragons and go on for almost 7 years now. It's been a lot of fun.
Wow, that's awesome. And it is... I love your blog. It is one of my favorite D&D blogs there is. And I love what you write about. I feel like as a person who has a blog, a lot of us write about like, here's my idea for a sorcerer. Here's a cool monster that I came up with, or let me rant about this thing for a little while that I don't like about the game and how I would fix it. What I find your blog posts, if you will allow me, are more like journalism than the rantings of a madman like mine are. Because you have research that goes into a lot of your articles, and when you make points, you draw back to interesting things, not just that are said in rule books of the game, but that have been written down in other accounts and interviews and books about how the game was actually made. You're a historian in a lot of ways. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I tend to sock away little nuggets that I hear or see over time. So, for example, on 4th edition, I had this theory that the game was sort of designed, the 4th edition game was designed to minimize the ability of a poor DM to hurt the playing experience. Ideally, in a 4th edition game, I say ideally, but this is sort of the vision for the 4th edition game, a dungeon master can get by with just reading the box text descriptions, running the monsters, and announcing what skills are needed for a skill challenge. And it's just that simple to do and that sort of routine. And I had this theory that was to keep a bad DM from hurting the game. And I didn't know whether that was true or not. So a few months ago, Mike Mearls, the creative director of D&D, had a series of tweets where he said exactly that one of the things that the design intent, starting with 3.5 and going into fourth, was to limit the ability of obnoxious DMs and players to hurt the game for an experience for other folks. So that kind of connected the dots for me right there, and I was off and running making a post. And I tend to sock away a lot of that kind of stuff, and as I get enough to make something happen, I pull it all together.
Yeah, let's get into your history a little bit. I know that we've talked at conventions and things like that. You've been playing the game for a while.
Right. I started back in the late 70s. I came to a new school, and let me set the scene for you a little bit, because in this modern time when the last Lord of the Rings movies wins an Oscar for Best Picture, it's really hard to picture what things were like back then as sort of the environment. At that time, fantasy was just for kids. You'd see it maybe in Disney movies. Maybe you'd see a Conan comic on the spinner. Lord of the Rings had been a little popular for a while, but people thought of it as just for hippies who refused to grow up. So fantasy was kid stuff. You hardly ever saw it in popular culture. And games were terrible. I loved games. I played them with my friends all the time. But, Monopoly was made almost 100 years ago. And there's a certain technological advance had gone since then. One of the games that I liked was this game called Prize Property, where you built real estate and then you sued the other players to try and prevent them from making real estate. So this is a game that's centered around legal action. And for some reason, the designers of this game thought this was going to be fun. But this was representative of the whole field of games out there. So when I'm in my new school and I heard some kids one table over in the lunchroom talking about this game where you killed monsters, and they were talking about the experience points you got for different monsters. And I grasped that you'd play a character and you'd get experience, and you went through dungeons and you killed them and your character got better. That was just absolutely electrifying. I had to find this game. So I went home and I started calling all the local hobby shops, because you couldn't just go into a bookstore and buy this thing. And I finally found a place that sold it. I convinced my mom to take me to the store, but I had to wait till the weekend. So I sat down and I tried to figure out how this amazing game could possibly be played. Without any context of what we have now, I was completely stumped. There was no way to go from the games that I'd played to something as magical as Dungeons and Dragons. That really set me off.
I am also old enough that I remember a time where gaming was really unpopular and for nerds, and I got made fun of it, right? You, like me, have seen the change, right? Like that now it is a thing that not only is it a thing that you can be proud of, it's a thing you can like tell people you do at parties and you become a little more interesting and that sort of thing. And you've been documenting not just that change happening in the game on your blog, you've also been documenting how the game itself has changed with the times, which I think is fascinating because, like you said, before D&D, there weren't games, at least widely known, that were like D&D, right? It was the first role-playing game.
Yeah, there was really, it was a massive leap in the notion of what a game could be. When I was first started playing D&D, I described the game to people, and the first question they asked was, well, how do you win? They inevitably asked that question because the notion that you could have a game as an activity, that you could just sit and do something, it's familiar now with video games and so on, but at the time, it seemed inconceivable that there would be a game where you didn't have an end and you didn't win. Very puzzling at the time.
Yeah. So like I just a few months ago had an opportunity to play with my parents for the first time. I think they realized, they were like, "Oh, you're serious about this thing." We invited my older sister to come with us, and it was really hard for her to grasp this concept of a game that's all about the journey and not the destination, right? That it's a game that's about the story you're sitting there and you're telling and the experience of fun and not the at the end, let's rack them up and see who wins, that kind of thing. It is fascinating to me then to see like, okay, so D&D is the first of its kind. It's the most popular. It's been through all of these iterations, and we kind of talk about at game shops and stuff, and you go in depth in your blog to show us how the game changed. So like, set it up at the beginning. What do you think was interesting about D&D at the start, right? Like the first edition of the game.
Right. So the first edition of the game was almost certainly everybody who's listening to this podcast knows, put together by guys named Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. And Dave and his group of players in Minneapolis really came up with the play style that was something that we would recognize as Dungeons and Dragons. Over time, they sort of developed the game, and then he showed it to a friend of his over in Lake Geneva, Gary Gygax, and demoed the game. And like me and like countless other people, Gary was totally smitten with the game right off the bat. But here's the thing, Dave, he was not a person he was not a real systematic guy about coming up with the rules. He would improvise the rules as they suited him. He kind of tended to keep them secret from the players because he liked the air of mystery, and he liked to be able to change them as he went along. So there wasn't a lot of stuff that was on writing. And when Gary saw this, he wanted to do the game, but all he could get is what's reputed to be 20-something pages of notes from Dave. So he took those notes and kind of took off and built a game around them based on what he'd seen and based on the notes and what his players devised. The ultimate game resembled something that Gary came up with as far as the nuts and bolts, a little bit more than the play style that Dave and his group invented. They didn't know, nobody knew how to make a role-playing game at the time. So all the mechanics were sort of improvised as they came up with the situation and decided, well, this is a good way to resolve this situation. Let's write that down, and that's the rule. So in that first game, everything worked differently from everything else. You rolled a D20 to hit. Thieves used a percentage die to pick locks. If you wanted to spot a secret door, you rolled on a D6 and saw what number came out. It was kind of a mishmash of all sorts of different mechanics. And there weren't any ability checks as we know them now. And that kind of shaped the way people played the game, because you couldn't, for example, roll a perception check to see if you found something to search. Instead, you described your action, were looking under the rug, and then if there was something there, you spotted it. If not, there wasn't. If you wanted to find a trapdoor, you'd knock on the floor with your 10-foot pole and see if something sprang open. It really relied heavily on player ingenuity and describing what they were doing, but it also left a sort of gap if there was something you couldn't, there wasn't obviously the outcome of an action. If you wanted to decide whether somebody could run across a falling bridge and make it to the other side, there wasn't any check you could make. You just have, the DM would just have to improvise some way of deciding whether your action succeeded or not.
Yeah, and I feel like that's one of the reasons we have so many stories of dungeon crawls taking longer than I think they do nowadays. You know, it's like, okay, you get in there, bada bing, roll a perception check, roll an investigation check. Okay, I think we found everything there is to find here. Let's move on. Next room, you know, where it's a more systematic sort of storytelling approach. And it also meant that like you said, when the DM is improvising, I think there are a lot of situations we get into with D&D now where it's like, okay, well, your paladin might have enough hit points to survive falling off of that bridge 30 feet into the water, right? But we as humans know that, like, well, you'd probably break your neck. And so that would just be the call that the DM would make rather than rolling for some damage and having a minor setback as opposed to a giant one. We hear about dead characters in those old editions all the time.
Exactly. Characters died all the time. One thing that shaped the first original game is that both Dave and Gary came from wargaming and miniature gaming. They loved competition, and they liked a game where you won or lost, in a sense, by having your character thrive or die. And they liked a lot of things in the game that really tested player skill. A lot of us don't find mapping particularly fun anymore, but to Gary, that was a supreme test of player skill, whether your map could match up with the dungeon as the DM described it. And, he liked things like encumbrance. He liked having spells like Fireball damage the treasure that you might find, because at the time, treasure was very much the way of keeping score, and characters gained most of their experience from claiming treasure. So that test of skill, if you could defeat the monster without using your fireball and burning up all your treasure, well, that was something that Gary approved of. And his son, Ernie, would talk about how Gary would always be secretive about the treasure that you found. You'd have to go and figure out what it did. But if you accidentally burned it up with a fireball, he'd say, tisk, tisk. Oh, that's a shame. You lost this and this. And it would drive Ernie and probably the other folks a little nuts. That drove Ernie to develop the Cone of Cold spell, which was a little bit higher level and didn't burn up treasure.
Oh, that's fascinating too, right? Because a lot of things that came out of the game were things that came out of these guys' home games, right? Like I know Mordenkainen and Bigby and Rary, right? All of those guys were actual player characters at some point.
Absolutely. So all those spells that have names attached to them are characters that were mostly in Gary's Greyhawk campaign. Tensor is Ernie Gygax's character, Gary's son.
Wow, that's incredible. So one of the things that I think is interesting, right, is Gary's there. He's developing this game. He's creating this game. Dave Arneson is creating this game. It gets, TSR happens. And then at some point, Gary is no longer involved, right? TSR says, no thanks, Gary, and sort of turns him away from the game.
Right. Gary had to gather investors, namely the Bloom brothers, to put together TSR Hobbies and keep it funded in the early days. And eventually, when the company went on some hard times, the Bloom brothers decided to sell out. And that meant that Gary was exiled from the company in 1985. He was actually formulating plans for a second edition at the time, and that never came to pass.
Do you know of anything from that second edition that, we didn't get?
Well, he had plans for some classes. He had, for example, something called a mountebank, which is a sort of trickster. Nowadays, it would probably be a charisma rogue. He had a few character designs, but mostly I think he just wanted to take another pass at the rules and bring out a game that was a little more polished. He had a lot of things in the first edition that he didn't particularly like. I think when Gary put together the first edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, he was still feeling very collaborative with the folks who wanted to suggest something or another. So he ended up with stuff that he didn't particularly like psionics. Gary was not a fan of psionics. He never used the things like the armor versus the attack versus armor tables, the weapon speed factors tables in his own games. And I think he wanted to clear some of that stuff out. He also had an idea for taking the skill system and making something out of it. I'm not sure that his second edition would have been a whole lot different from the second edition we actually saw, but I'm not sure that Gary had the skills that his talents were for taking all the great ideas and piling them together. But for a systematic design and maybe organizing and writing rules with clarity that a younger reader might be able to understand, I don't think Gary really had that talent. So there might have been some gains that he wasn't able to do the second edition that he was planning.
It is a fascinating thing. And there's, like I said, whole books written about this subject and sort of the kind of what Gary did and how he worked and that sort of thing. But let's talk about second edition a little bit. So what changes as the game evolves and we get to second edition?
Right. So second edition, when the team got the directive to start working on second edition, most of that was driven and sold to TSR management as a chance to recast the game so that a broader audience could understand and appreciate the rules, reorganize it, and things like that. The design team had a lot of ideas that they wanted to put forth as improvements. So, for example, in the original edition, armor classes went down as they got tougher armor. And that ended up with negative armor classes, and you had to consult with tables to see whether you hit or not. That seemed kind of awkward to just about everybody, though there are some fans of that. And they wanted to flip that to the armor classes ascending like we see now. They thought that maybe by doing that, they could have a cleaner system for checks that would enable it to work the same as armor class. And they had other ideas along those lines. But the directive from TSR management was that second edition had to be broadly compatible with the prior game. TSR still had a lot of products on store shelves. They had a lot of products in their warehouse. And products tended to have a much longer shelf life at that time. So they really didn't want to do anything that deterred their audience from buying the existing products. Plus, at that time, new editions tended to be minor refinements of the game. If you wanted to do a whole new rethinking of a game, you'd make it a totally new name. So there was at that time there was Traveler, and then the new edition was Mega Traveler. And that meant that second edition just didn't have a big change. Now, over time, the edition did sort of evolve. They started selling the complete books and introducing kits and other character options to the game. The first ones of those worked out pretty well. They were done in-house. I think subsequent ones where they were done by freelancers did not do so well. And they did suffer from another drawback because they tended to use role-playing restrictions to balance characters. And I think over time, the design team decided that there were enough people who were willing to ignore the role-playing restrictions or work around them, that those weren't a good balancing mechanism.
It's interesting, right? That because I think we see a lot of people say things like, you're the DM, you decide, yada, yada. But if you do read some of those second edition books, there are definitely restrictions on a lot of stuff about what you can be and what you can't be, and only take stuff from this box set and not this box set and that kind of thing. Hey, everybody. I just wanted to take a quick break to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Kobold Press. Kobold Press are the makers of many fine D&D products, such as Warlock. Warlock is a Patreon-supported project from Kobold Press, who makes the Midgard campaign setting for 5th edition D&D. With your support, the Kobolds can make new 5e Midgard material on this regular, ongoing basis. I've been a member from the beginning, and it is incredible. You get all kinds of stuff. I'm talking about new maps, new dungeons, new monsters, new character options, adventures, and so much more. It's all for Midgard, but guess what? You can use it in any dark fantasy D&D game, really any fantasy game. It is pretty awesome. Check it out at patreon.com/koboldpress. I also wanted to let you know that this episode of Tabletop Babble is brought to you by Nerdarchy. You know Nerdarchy. They've been on this podcast before. They make incredible content, YouTube videos, blog posts, products, and more. Well, they're launching their first ever Kickstarter, and you are going to want to go check it out right now. The Kickstarter is for Out of the Box Encounters, which began as a series of posts on Nerdarchy's website and will now have all kinds of amazing things that you can drop into any 5th edition game. Go check it out. These are amazing encounters that just have all kinds of great stuff. And guess what? I'll be contributing. That's right, me, James Inchicasso. Also, Lisa Penrose. Lisa Penrose, who you know of the Behold Her podcast, right, on this network. You're going to want to check it out. There's so many other great people. Guy Schlanders. There is so much good stuff. So go check it out. It's Nerdarchy has launched today. If you're listening to the podcast when it launched today, they've launched their first ever Kickstarter for Out of the Box Encounters. Let's get back to the babble. Do you think that role-playing restrictions might be a thing we see come back, especially now in the era of games that are more focused on story being on the rise? Often you'll see, I guess they're not really restrictions, but advice about this is how this kind of character should be played. You know, whenever you do X, Y, or Z behavior, you know, instead of restrictions, you're more incentivized to act a certain way.
Yeah, I think there would be a bigger appetite for that. Certainly that's the way the audience is changing. But I suspect the design team really would prefer to have not use that as a balancing mechanism.
I think that makes sense. So let me ask you a question. A lot of stuff happens. Second edition is around for a long time, right? And then we get to third. But how do we get to third? How does that happen? Because there's also a change in the owner of the IP.
Right. One of the things that we might come back to in a little bit when we talk about fourth edition, and certainly has shaped D&D throughout its history, is that role-playing is a incredibly cheap hobby. Somebody can buy the 3 Dungeons and Dragons books, the core books, and play pretty much indefinitely based on just those books and whatever they come up with. And then, you know, if you do decide you want to buy an adventure or an expansion, you can buy one of the hardcover adventures that they do now, and one person will buy the adventure, and then that person can run it for a year and provide entertainment for a whole table of 5 or 6 other people. It's ridiculously cheap as entertainment. And that's something that the game market has struggled with. For a while, what they do is they publish a lot of material, more material that anyone could ever play as sitting down at the table with other folks. But instead, they kind of sold it to folks who are more interested in reading the material. So you'd buy the City of Splendor's Waterdeep book, and you'd sit down and read it and enjoy it and then shelve it, and maybe you would never play that. You certainly would have several more books every month coming out to fill that void, and the hope was that people would keep buying that. But unfortunately, eventually, too few people keep buying keep buying the books as the editions go on. And eventually the finances get tight with each edition. I think that kind of happened in the middle of the 90s. Well, TSR was publishing an avalanche of material. They were sending it to booksellers who were paying in advance for it with the promise that they could return it. And then at some point, the market just wouldn't absorb any more product. So the booksellers said, okay, we're going to return all this stuff. And suddenly TSR, sometime in the second half of the 90s, was faced with all these returns and not enough revenue coming in. And it looked like the company might just go bankrupt. That could have been bad news for Dungeons and Dragons as we know it, because a lot of companies would just see a product like D&D as a potential IP to license off to other companies for movies and comics and so on, and see the game as just a minor addition to the branding line. That's kind of what happened to the World of Darkness games that White Wolf came out and were very popular in the 90s, but were eventually sold off to a series of video game companies who weren't really interested in tabletop games. They were really only interested in the IP. And that was the sort of fate that could have awaited Dungeons and Dragons when it was sold, when TSR was running on hard times. But what happened is it was sold to Wizards of the Coast, who was run by a bunch of guys who loved Dungeons and Dragons and were eager to take charge of the board game. That was kind of a save for the game, and they got involved in putting together the third edition.
What is fascinating about it is that you really do see that exact same thing you're talking about. We see in comic books, right? The comic books are still written, but they're basically still written to make movies and action figures and all of the other things that come along with Spider-Man, right? It's not because people are reading massive amounts of comics. And so it's great that D&D ended up in the hands of people who were interested in making the game. And that's not to disparage people who make comics now. There are a lot of wonderful comic book authors, illustrators, editors, and everything still out there. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying that, but I definitely see what you're saying. And I have seen like, oh no, is it going to go that way with Dungeons and Dragons a couple times throughout its history, even after it got to Wizards of the Coast. So Wizards of the Coast then sits down to make third edition, and like a couple of brilliant things happen and a couple of crazy things happen that I think for the time weren't so crazy, right? I think we look back on third edition now and we see all of the rules that it had created and we laugh, but at the time that was like, finally there's a rule for everything, right?
Right. And that goes back to that notion of giving dungeon masters enough rules to make everything in the game sort of procedural, so that the ability of a weaker dungeon master to run a bad game is lessened. Plus, there was originally with third edition, they were very mindful of that mechanic, that pattern where the products for a game sold less and less and less as the game went on. And really the only big money products for a game were the core books. The original plan was to come out with the 3 core books and then have the D20 license and the open gaming license be a means for everyone else to make all those low margin products that would support the game. Well, what happened is there was a lot of pent-up demand and a pent-up love for Dungeons and Dragons, so the new edition boomed. And the prospect of putting out new products just proved irresistible. What happened is a lot of these products came out and people were buying them up for a while, But the pattern did win out once again, where the sales fell, and eventually they started looking at how to save Dungeons and Dragons for 4th edition.
Well, and we even had basically an edition change between the two, right? I mean, 3.5 put out all new core rule books. I was buying a new player's handbook, a new dungeon master's guide, and a new monster manual. Then, what was the story there that we should put out this 3.5 edition?
Well, I think the plan is that they were going to tweak the game just a little bit. They had a lot of little changes that they thought the game, after 3 years or so of testing or actual play, that merited. They thought they would have a tune-up of a new edition and it would be broadly compatible. I think what they didn't expect is that the 0.5 on those books really put off a lot of folks. So suddenly everything that wasn't labeled 3.5 was out of date, and people no longer were interested in buying that off the shelves. And I think a lot of folks in the business blamed 3.5 with precipitating a crash in the D20 market and shortening the life of the edition.
And another big thing that I think we see with 3rd is the OGL. From a design standpoint, for me, I feel like that changed D&D in the sense that, like, all of a sudden, all these third-party people who previously were trying to compete with their game, right? Like, please come play my game, please come do this, now had an avenue to sell content to people who played D&D. They didn't have to convince you to learn a whole new rule set. They could make stuff that you would buy anyway.
Right. And that was a blessing and a curse, wasn't it? Because we were seeing games like D20 Call of Cthulhu come out. That was a Wizards of the Coast version that was devised to show how much you could do with the D20 license. But it also kind of took one of the great masterpieces of role-playing games and shoveled it into D20. So a lot of folks felt like by putting everything under the D20 license, the environment was a little less diverse and a little less healthy. On the other hand, it certainly gave everybody a chance to dive into the market, and we saw a lot of folks that are designers now get their start in that environment.
Yeah, totally. And it just is a fascinating thing to see, like, because I think that also plays at least a little bit into the 4th edition story, and we got to go there, right? We got to talk about 4th edition. And I actually played a lot of 4th edition. I played 2 level 1 to 30 games that I ran, and played a lot of one-shots and organized play and things like that. What happened with 4th edition? How did we get there? Why do people want to throw holy water on it and hold up a cross when its name comes up? Like, what happened with 4th edition?
I think the story of 4th edition is fascinating because people tend to think of it as something that just was a rash major change. But to the design team at the time, they saw 4th edition and that as a big grand stroke to try and save Dungeons and Dragons. At the time, Wizards of the Coast had been sold to Hasbro, and Hasbro was really only interested in the Magic the Gathering and other collectible card games as the business. They happened to get Dungeons and Dragons along with the deal, but they could have certainly seen Dungeons and Dragons as a potentially outlet for licensing it to video games and so on, as we mentioned earlier, and really not something that merited a tabletop game. To a company of the size of Hasbro, whatever profits D&D was making at the time, it was just a rounding error. It hardly merited the return on investment. The D&D design team thought they needed a grand stroke to try and vault fourth edition up to the sorts of levels that Hasbro would be determined to keep it as a tabletop game with a dedicated design team and regular products coming out. So they arrived at a plan. Part of the plan came from the fact at the time that World of Warcraft was absolutely booming. Just a few years before 4th edition, it had 3.5 million players, but by the time 4th edition came out, it had 11 million players. And if you were haunting game stores at the time, from time to time, you'd hear about people who used to be playing some other game at the table were now lost to World of Warcraft. Well, the design team of Dungeons and Dragons thought this is a sort of audience that we want to tap into. And there were a number of other things that contributed to the 4th edition design. First of all, the design theory at the time was that what players wanted from the game was they wanted to build characters and fiddle with the options and then take them to a tabletop and sort of show them off. The advantage of building characters is that they could come out with a lot of products with character options, and people could have their solitary fun buying up all these products and constructing characters and then get together with a group. But the other component that they wanted to do to increase the revenue is they wanted to have a virtual tabletop. The vision is that someone could subscribe to the virtual tabletop and you'd log in anytime, day or night, jump onto any game somewhere in the world, much like people do with D20 or other virtual tabletops now, and play Dungeons and Dragons in a virtual tabletop. And then if they made the rules procedural enough so that differences between dungeon masters were minimized, because all they had to do was read the box text or announce the skills that were required in a skill challenge or run the monsters, then you'd have a pretty uniform experience no matter what game you joined. So they had this vision of collecting monthly subscriptions for the tabletop, people playing D&D from the comfort of their home and appealing to the same 11 million folks plus who were playing World of Warcraft at the time. I think that seemed like a good plan at the time, but it didn't turn out the way they'd hoped.
Yeah, I remember the marketing campaign for like opening up an issue of Game Informer magazine and seeing an ad for 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and it was like a cross section of a house and somebody up alone in a dark room just lit by their computer screen playing probably an MMO like World of Warcraft, and then beneath them in a kitchen a whole group of people laughing and having fun in a well lit room playing D&D. And the tagline was, "At least you'll know the hot elf chick you're playing with is a dude." And it was like obviously a direct call out, right, to World of Warcraft and MMOs. And it's just fascinating, that was kind of the play. And there was a lot of things in 4th edition that I think were really cool. Like I loved At Will Magic, which is now part of the game, right? I loved the action economy, which is basically now still part of the game. They changed the name bonus action or minor action to bonus action, right? Which I think helped clear some things up. But there's a lot of things that are the same that are just almost just rebranded. You know what I mean? Like, hey, this is... We put some carrots in your apple juice so that you wouldn't know you're drinking carrots, right? It does feel like some 4th edition stuff made it into the game, and I definitely think we wouldn't have 5th, or 5th would not be what it was without 4th. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. There's a lot of great, call it technology, that comes from 4th edition over to 5th. And Jeremy Crawford is the lead designer of Dungeons and Dragons, has said as much, that 5th edition would not be what it is without 4th edition.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is fascinating, right? Fourth gets a lot of crap for long combats, which were definitely a thing, for complicated combats, which I think were definitely a thing. I played a lot of Fourth. Eventually, this Essentials version came out of Fourth. Little paperback, well, not little, they were pretty thick paperback books that were sort of a soft relaunch of Fourth Edition that had more streamlined options for characters. And I remember all of the complaining we did about like how long stuff was when I put those down in front of my players, them saying, well, no, now you're taking my options away. Now I don't have as many choices. I don't get to do as many things. So I don't want to use those because I feel less powerful. What did you think about the Essentials?
Well, you're right on the nose there, James. That's how my players felt too. What the designers said about fourth edition after it launched and struggled is, first of all, they felt like they made too many changes all at once, and the audience was not ready to embrace all those changes. But they've also said that they felt like they ran out of time to make the game they really wanted to make. And that meant things like every character in the original release of fourth edition had the same power structure as every other one. And that meant that playing a wizard felt a whole lot like playing a fighter. They didn't originally want to do it that way, but they ran out of time, so they had to take a shorter route to deliver the game. I think Essentials, they managed to get all the time that they needed to put it out. They managed to address all the weaknesses that had shown up in the original release, and certainly came out with a much better game if it's restricted to that essential subset. But by that time, it was really too late. It was a salvage effort that was trying to make the best they could out of the situation they had. And it wasn't too much after Essentials. It may have even already been during the time that Essentials came out. They were already looking to fifth edition and trying to figure out how they would take their do-over.
And then we get to fifth edition. How did we get to where we are today? Which one thing I want to point out about fifth, right? We just talked about third and 3.5 and fourth. At this point in the life of third, 3.5, and fourth, we knew the next thing was coming. It had been announced that, hey, we're working on a new edition. Hey, there is no sign of that right now with fifth edition, that there's some sort of new edition or even a soft, like a relaunch of fifth edition coming up. So that's just one thing I want to note as we get into what's different about fifth and why.
Well, I think the clever lesson that they learned from the prior editions led them to do the playtest, where they sent out the playtest versions of the game and got an excellent handle on what the audience actually wanted. Fourth edition was really rolled out blind. We didn't see anything of it until that announcement at Gen Con a few months before the hardcovers hit. Fifth edition, we saw, what was it, a year or so of playtests, and everyone got a chance to weigh in on what they liked and didn't like. So that led to some really valuable insights into the game. One of the things I think some of the designers thought might be the case is that die-hard D&D players who are taking part in the playtest might really like a complicated, challenging player testing game. But what turned out is people were very comfortable with a much simpler game with mechanics that were broad and elegant, like advantage and disadvantage. I think all those lessons from the playtest really boosted the design quite a lot.
Definitely. There are a lot of things that I think hit all at once. I saw somebody say this, why is everyone obsessed with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons? And I think a big part of it has to do with the playtest and the a lengthy playtest that I think got everybody really excited for it, right? That was also, whether intentional or not, ended up generating a lot of excitement for like, oh, this is coming, and oh, now it's here. Like, we can't wait. The fact that they took this slower release schedule that they had finally learned. And I remember I said, this is crazy. This will never work, this release schedule. You need to put out things for people to buy. How else can you run a business? And I'm so glad I was wrong, because it just makes sense that it's like, well, what we're doing is we're growing the audience, and that's how we're getting more products sold. We're selling players handbooks. They can't print them fast enough, and that sort of thing. So that's another great thing that happened. And now, obviously, I do think there was a little bit of synergy too, that this actual play movement happened to hit at the right time, and the success of shows like Critical Role and The Adventure Zone have really helped move some books as well.
Yeah, I think you're on the nose with all those things. The slower release schedule has definitely helped the lifespan of the game, as well as having a solid, very sound game coming out to begin with. But they also got a little lucky. In the old days, if you wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons, if you were interested in, if you even wanted to see it played, you pretty much needed to get an invitation to a game in somebody's basement. Until you came into somebody's house and sat down and played the game, there was really no other way to see the game played. So it was really mysterious to a lot of people. People felt like people who might be good fits for the game, who might enjoy it, there was no way to get to it unless you personally knew somebody was running a game. Now you can hit YouTube and see countless hours of groups playing the game in different styles, and it unlocks a lot of the mystery. And I think that's been indispensable in broadening the appeal of the game, to reaching the folks that could have been huge fans before, but really had no opportunity to see it played.
I think that's totally true. And it's one of those things that has become, the advent of videos on the internet and being able to listen to podcasts and things like that. It didn't occur to me until I was doing it myself that it's like, oh yeah, it allows people to consume D&D more readily, right? It used to be, if I was going to read a D&D book, I had to be in a position where I could have my eyes locked on that book, right? Or a message board or whatever it was. And now I can enjoy D&D while I am folding laundry or doing the dishes or going out to work out or that sort of thing. There are multiple ways now that we're able to get it, and that I think has made a big difference. And when I think about the launch of 5th edition, right, there were some things that that were missing. Like, it was like, oh well, where's the virtual platform, right? We didn't get D&D Beyond until we were years into this thing. We were buying hardcover books in 2014. There was no real option for a virtual book yet, and that sort of thing. So it is fascinating that it still got as popular as it got without the help of those things, without the OGL didn't come out until D&D was, 2 years into 5th edition. So it's really, really incredible to see the growth of this thing now.
Absolutely. And so gratifying to see all the folks embracing the game now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, David, I would love to have you back to talk a little bit more about D&D history and mechanics and all of the things that we like to talk about at conventions, because I feel like we had just scratched the surface, and we could do deep dives into, specific mechanics and their evolution and that sort of thing. So I do hope you'll come back. But in the meantime, where can people find you on the internet?
Well, you can read my blog at dmdavid.com, and you can follow me at Twitter at dmdavidblog.
Excellent. And people should. It is one of the best D&D blogs out there on the internet. I would say the best, but I know Mike Shea listens to this podcast, so I don't want him to come after me.
Yes. I appreciate that, but I do feel like I'm still trying to catch up with Mike, so there is that.
Well, he's a giant in the industry, but so are you, my friend, and thank you really for coming on. This has been awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'd love to be back sometime.
Wow, what an awesome conversation with DM David. We have to have him back. People, Tabletop Babble is a expensive show to produce, and we could really, really use your help. Head on over to patreon.com/Intricasso to support the show. You can get all kinds of rewards there, including a monthly survey that helps you vote on the direction of this show and more content from me. It's at patreon.com/INTROCASO. And people, if you want to support us, but you can't do so financially, go leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It would really help a lot. And if you leave us a 5-star review, I'll read it out loud and credit the person who left it. You can make me say anything you want. All right, you can find me on Twitter at James Intricasso and on my blog, worldbuilderblog.com. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Don't forget, RPGs are like sex.
I'm Lisa Chen, and I host Behold Her, a monthly podcast that shines a spotlight on women in the world of tabletop games. There are so many women to behold in this amazing hobby, and our experiences as female gamers are as diverse as we are as individuals. Through one-on-one interviews, audio essays, and panel discussions, all centered around a monthly theme, the guests on Behold Her share their unique stories as players, game masters, designers, artists, organizers, and so much more. Their words are inspiring, uplifting, and informative. Check out Behold Her Podcast wherever podcasts are found, or visit beholdherpodcast.com.